joining us. It's an enormous privilege for me to be able to be here today and have this conversation with our distinguished speaker, Marie Arana, whom I'm grateful for joining us here today, and also for all of you here in person and virtually. Thank you for being here. Before getting into details and introducing our honored speaker, I would like to take a second to acknowledge that we are guests of Kumeyaay on ceded territory and pay respects to the land and to the Kumeyaay people, past and present, who continue to nourish that relationship. As for our honored guest, in addition to what we have learned, Marie Arana is a bicultural Peruvian-born American with a distinguished career as an author, editor, journalist, and critic, who for more than a decade served as editor-in-chief of and member of the book review section for the Washington Post. Marie Arana has earned her BA in Russian from Northwestern University and a master's in linguistics from the University of Hong Kong with a certificate of scholarship from Yale University in China. As an author, her work, which were mentioned earlier, ranged from fiction to historical autobiographical narratives. In the text that we will talk about today, LATINOLAND, a portrait of America's largest and least understood minority, Marie Arana masterfully blends these literary forms to include the rigor of journalist reporting in statistics, interviews, historical recapitulations, the vulnerability of autobiographical writing, all weaved by the mastery of literary sensibility and compelling, moving language that draws its readers and keeps us engaged. So without further ado, again, please welcome Marie Arana. So could you share with us what motivated you to accomplish this massive undertaking? And I mean massive, not just in the sense of the length of the book, but what you try to do here, which is question the narratives that distorts and erases many contributions of Latinos and Latinas and Latinx in the United States. It's a book that teaches us, and I'm going to include myself here, important figures that have been dismissed through history and are present, and also gives us very detailed information and data and statistics on our community's relationship to mobility, education, crime, media, and so on. So what compelled you to this massive work?
Insanity. This has been a mission of mine for a very long time. You know, when I started my career in books in New York in two publishing houses, the Latino world did not exist for them. Nobody was listening. In fact, I remember James Reston, Scotty Reston, who was the executive editor of the New York Times, said, "Oh, Americans love Latin America, and they love Latin Americans, but they don't want to read about them." And, you know, this bespoke a kind of, not only an invisibility, which you mentioned, a neglect, a kind of unawareness of the deep history that Latinos have in this country all the way back. And the presence, the growing presence, especially the presence that I was witnessing myself in these publishing houses, but nobody wanted to read about Latinos. I went to the Washington Post, and they actually asked me. I remember the first day at the Post when I was coming to work in the book section as the books editor of the Post. The question was, "Oh, you were born in Lima, Peru?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, can we put you down as a minority hire?" And I said, "Well, yes." And they paid attention. They paid attention to the fact for the first time that because they could use me, they could send me out. They knew, the Washington Post were very aware of the large and growing population of Latinos in the metropolitan area of Washington. So even though I was doing books, I began writing about them in a very sort of scattered way whenever, you know, a story came up. But it occurred to me that I had really lost that little girl that had come over at the age of 10 from Lima. And I wanted to go back and recover her first. And in the process, I became convinced that what I really wanted to do was to educate people about, not only about Latin America, but about who we were, where we came from, what the history was, why we were different, why we were the same. And so I began with a memoir, and as we said, the two novels, trying to do a different genre every time to see where I fit in that story and where I could tell the story best. And after doing history after history, which I found very comfortable, I had edited. It was not as if this was a new genre for me. I had edited biographies. I had edited history. I had edited novels. So everything that I tried, I had actually done before for somebody else as an editor. So I found that what really fascinated me most was the way the history connected with the present and how it was so firmly embedded in the present, not only for Latinos, Latin Americans who were coming here, but for the Americans themselves, of the awareness and the lack of awareness that we were here. And really it was that kind of invisibility that motivated me. In my lifetime, the US Census counted, when I arrived, 2 million Latinos, most of whom were Mexican. Mexicans were not even counting themselves as Latinos or Hispanics or anything, because as you remember in history, the Mexicans, when Manifest Destiny and Westward Ho pushed into all that Spanish land and all that Mexican land, and that land was huge. It went all the way from California to Kansas, and it went all the way from the Rio Grande up to Colorado. So when it pushed into that land, all the Mexicans were essentially pushed back. When in 1848, when the really invasion was done and the United States of America paid for the land, eventually just to settle the deal, Mexico insisted that all Mexicans who remained, and we don't even know how many they were because they weren't counting themselves, the Mexicans that remained on the territory would be called white. Why? Because if you weren't white, you couldn't vote. And the Mexicans wanted to protect the Mexicans who were left behind. So they said, we want them to be white. America, as we know, has been from time immemorial binary in its racial counting and its ethnicity counting. And so Mexicans became white. They weren't being counted at all. So this sort of, it fascinated me, this whole question of invisibility. And as I say, those 2 million in, let's say, the early 1960s, 1959, 1960, is now 64 million. And not only has there been a huge, extraordinary growth, but there has been an awareness that you count yourself, that you put yourself down. And that awareness has grown more and more over the years. I wanted to capture that population for that reason, because this was very possibly, and many ambassadors have said this to me, this is very possibly one of the largest Latin American nations in the world, this population. We are the second largest Spanish-speaking nation in the world, next to Mexico, Latinos in this country. So that's why.
Well, and that's not a small task, considering the complexities of our communities, complexities as far as ethnic, racial, class, country. And in your own background, there's quite a bit of complexity in your story too that you bring to what you share with us. Could you share some of your experience in terms of the complexities that, you know,
my family?
Oh, exactly, please.
My family, my father, Peruvian, many generations, all the way from, I think it was 1570 that the original Aranas came to Peru. We were all over, actually. Ecuador, the Andean nations is really where the Aranas are, my family. During the World War II, of course, the classrooms in the universities in this country were emptied out because all the young men were sent off to war, and the young women were sent into working for the war effort. And the universities were hurting. So the State Department went down to Latin America, to the allied countries, and recruited bright South Americans to come and fill the classrooms. My father was recruited by the State Department to come to MIT to do his graduate work at MIT. He had finished the engineering school in Lima. He was having lots of fun, having a great time as a young man. Believe me, he was quite a rogue and having lots of fun. And when he was offered this by the State Department, he said, well, you know, MIT, what's that? No, he was having too much of a good time. When they came back the next year and offered it, and he had learned that the MIT offer was a pretty good one, he actually went to MIT to do his graduate work. This was in 1943. My mother, who had been born in Kansas, eloped at the age of 16, went off to lead a life on the West Coast. She was here in San Francisco, and then moved up to Seattle to finish her university. Eventually decided she wanted to become a violinist. She was a very good musician, an excellent musician. And she ended up in Boston, in the building of the New England Conservatory of Music, next to the dormitories of the MIT graduate students. So you get the picture. They fell in love in the cafeteria. There was a shared cafeteria. And my father, at the end of the war, when he finished his degree, he went and worked for General Electric, building turbines for the war effort. And eventually, he took my mother and went to Peru, and she became an immigrant to Peru. And she was the only American I knew, because we immediately, my father being an engineer, was building huge factories and towns and whole nexus of production of paper, sugar, and throughout Peru. And we moved up to a very small hacienda that was operated, American-owned hacienda, outside of Trujillo. So I grew up really in the boonies on the coast, educated entirely by my mother. So I learned English, but she was the only American I knew. So the rest of my world and my family was really Peruvian. And my whole mindset was Peruvian, with this very early American education. And when my parents decided that they wanted to have their children educated in the United States, this was a very, very firm desire on the part of my mother. We moved when I was almost 10 years old to Summit, New Jersey, and that's where I grew up, and tried to completely became American, which was not an easy effort in the beginning, I will tell you, because there were not many of us. There were not many. Southern New Jersey which is now full of Latinos. The only Latinos I ever saw were my brother and my sister.
Thank you for sharing that. In addition to the stories that you gathered from your family, which you share in your book, you also gather the stories of many, many, many countless people. And there's quite a bit of labor involved in the information you share in LATINOLAND. Can you share with the public what kind of work went behind this?
Of course, it's a lifetime of work, really, in many respects. But
excuse me.
When
They didn't hear the question.
The question was what if she could share the type of work, the amount of work, or what type of work entailed to be able to develop this text, LATINOLAND, because there's hundreds of interviews. So I want to hear about what kind of labor went behind, not just her own story, but also the stories of so many people that are shared in this book.
Thank you. When I had written the story of Simon Bolivar, which was an attempt, really, every book was an attempt to educate a certain slice of Latinos in our world. And the story about Simon Bolivar, the reason I picked him was because he covered more territory. I mean, he liberated 6 republics. He went all the way from the Caribbean all the way down to Bolivia. So the geography was huge. The chronology was huge because his family had been in Latin America, in this hemisphere, for 300 years already. So the story of how they came and how that happened and how the family developed was a really interesting story because it covered a lot of chronological time. In that process of writing about the revolution, there were some very eureka moments for me because it was in the revolution, in the wars of independence in Latin America, that the difference between Latin America and the United States of America was made very clear to me. That realization prompted me to write Silver, Sword, and Stone, which was an attempt to bring that whole history to the present and to really describe how it is that we are prisoners of the past in this book. Thank you, James, for holding that up. So it was Silver, Sword, and Stone, really, that both of those books educated me to such a degree that I pretty much had the history down, that the history that is in here. What I didn't have down was the stories of the people on the street. You live in a very elite world in Washington, D.C., where you're dealing with people who read the sort of books that you read, and it's a little sort of echo chamber. And I wanted to get out and really talk to people. I did 237 interviews for this book, 237 people, all the way from grape pickers and menial workers and construction workers and housekeepers, and to all the way to doctors and lawyers and musicians and actors and actresses and CEOs of major corporations, and doing that due diligence. And I'll tell you why there were 237. Most people do for a book like this somewhere between 50 and 100. And the reason I did 237 was because I wasn't sure what I was doing. And the population was so large, so various, so diverse, so extraordinarily driven that I couldn't stop. I wanted to meet everybody. And I in the process, I met some extraordinary people. Julia, a grape picker who was actually picking peaches in California, crossed the border at the age of 14, was illegal and had been undocumented for many, many years, somehow was recognized by a teacher in a public school, pushed along, ended up going to Harvard Medical School, and ended up being a neurosurgeon who has developed just the most extraordinary process for brain surgery. It is a story, and I kept running into stories like this all the time. The drive, the work ethic, the dedication, the wanting the next generation to be better and bigger and more accomplished just was inspiring to me, and I couldn't stop meeting one person after another. So I spent a lot of time not writing and talking to people. And it was then, there was the process of selecting, well, which one am I going to focus on, which ones? And in the scores of notebooks that I created, that was the hard part. The hard part was choosing the people who would be, you know, the highlights and tell you more in the appropriate places in this book. But it was a joy to write. It was really an inspiring, but the most inspiring and the most difficult book I've ever written.
Definitely. I mean, as I read it, there were so many moving stories from some of the people that you interviewed, but there's also a lot of information, archival information about people who, the things that have been done in the past by people who have been erased by the dominant narrative. And there's also a lot of information on statistics of what's happening and what has been happening with the Latino community in the United States. What kind of, what challenges or how did you get to all that information. I learned so much from you in
Thank
this book. Mhm.
Thank you so much. I think I have this idea that the best way to tell a story is through human experience, of course. But in that story of human experience, there's so much data you can deliver. Each one of us has a story that's full of data and statistics and that represents a larger sort of population. So I like to dolly up close to a person's life and then sort of dolly back and tell the context of that person's life. And so context, story and history, and all of that, each person has an economic history as well as a personal history. And all of that is representative of a greater story that you can tell. What surprised me was how little, this is a really big issue for me, how little we learn in the schools about the Latino presence in this country. We learn about, for instance, David Farragut, whose real name was Ferragut. He has a statue that's standing on Farragut Square, which is 6 blocks, even less, I think, from the White House. He has a bust. You walk into the Army Navy Club in Washington, D.C., and there's a big bust of now he's known as Farragut, but his name is Ferragut. Hispanic, Latino, first admiral in the U.S. Navy. The original admiral in the U.S. Navy was a Latino. Do we read that in textbooks? No, we don't. Do we know from textbooks or in schoolrooms that, Stephen Vincent Benet, who was a writer, very well known, very well read writer in the United States of America, his father was Esteban Vicente Benet, right, from St. Augustine, Florida, back in the time when St. Augustine was a Spanish colony. And this was the head of ordnance at West Point that managed all the ammunition for the Civil War. Latino. Do we know that from the school books? No. It was just one story after another. A musician, a child musician who was brought to play for Abraham Lincoln in the White House, an extraordinary musician who went on to teach in New York the most revered pianists of her time. Is that in the textbooks? No. So this became an obsession to me. It was like, oh, all the things that we should be learning in school to highlight the achievements of this population. The Latinos have fought in every war that was prosecuted in this country, starting from the Revolutionary War. George Washington once said that he could not have won the war if the Spanish forces that came up from the Caribbean, the Latinos who were coming up from Texas, didn't actually break the blockade that the English had imposed. George Washington would not have had any ammunition if that were the case. So all the way from the Revolutionary War to now, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, 26% of United States Marines are Hispanic. I think about that, 1 out of 4 Marines, United States Marines, is a Hispanic. It's remarkable to me how little we are told of that achievement and that presence and that sort of phenomenal contributions to this country.
Yeah, indeed. And, part of the challenge, as you mentioned in your book, has to do with the lack of representation in the white collar areas or in the admiral level areas of whether it be the army or boardrooms or what may be. But there's also the question of the diversity and the complexity of the Latino community. And also even when it comes to its name, right? Latino community, there's some pushback to that. Latinx, Latine, Latino. What did you mean in your book? Why did you choose the title of LATINOLAND? What did it?
Speak the microphone, please.
Yes,
We can't hear that.
I'm sorry, thank you. So,
Left hand, because you're constantly turning, yeah.
yes, thank you. It's just that I'm right-handed, so it's my bad. I need to practice both sides of my brain. So what I was saying is that the Latino community is so complex that even the name Latino can be controversial because some people see it as a pan-ethnic identity that erases particularities. Some prefer Latinx, some prefer Latine, some talk about Hispanics, and so it's not that doesn't help this question of invisibility as far as the absence of the community in the higher levels of decision makings and so forth. So my question was, how did the name LATINOLAND come to be, given all the complexities that it entails and the possibilities of the labels that can be used? What do you mean by LATINOLAND?
Yeah, it's a confusing point because it is, the truth is we don't have a name. I begin the book by talking about the fact that we really don't have a name, and it's perplexing for an author to refer to us because it began this way. Napoleon invaded Spain. This was back in early 1800s, first decade of the 1800s. Napoleon invades Spain. Napoleon then realizes he's got this huge colonial structure in Latin America that is now his. And so in the process of trying to win the colonies to Napoleon's rule, to his empire, he basically pushed the notion that we're all Latins. We are just like the French, the Latinos, because we are Latins, and this is a Latin world, and this unites us. So we became Latin America. The name stuck. Yeah, America Latina. It became the name. And then what happens? Time goes by, and comes 1960s, 1970s. Nixon realizes that he's from California. His father was a grocer. He knew Latinos through the agricultural workers who had actually furnished the fruit and the vegetables that his father then distributed. So Nixon is very aware of the Latino presence, and he's very interested in Latinos. He's very worried that in his first run for the presidency, he had such a low turnout of Latinos. So he actually makes a push to not only unite this population, but to make sort of an electorate out of them. And he calls them Hispanics. It was President Nixon who actually established the Hispanic Heritage Day. So we became, starting with Napoleon, we were called Latinos, and then with Nixon, we were called Hispanics. There is some objection because Hispanics means you are Spanish, and we are not. We're a mix of everything. We are a mix of every race of man. We are, of course, Spanish European, and we're indigenous, and we're Black, and we're Asians, and some of us are all of these, which I am, all of those races. And so there was a little pushback with Hispanics, but there are some very wonderful institutions that call themselves Hispanic. I mean, the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, any number of good, solid institutions that call themselves Hispanics. And then comes along the question of gender inclusivity. And so then we become Latinx, but to very, very few, actually just 2% of Latinos use the term Latinx. It's a term, so Napoleon imposes a term on us, Nixon imposes a term on us, and now the Academy, basically the American Academy, says, okay, you've got to be more representative of the gender differences, so let's use Latinx. It hasn't stuck. And there's a small contingent of people who, particularly writers, who say, okay, let's just chuck all of that and call ourselves Latine. And so we're basically, we have all these labels, that refer to us. It's amazing that we feel unity in spite of this. I think most Latinos call themselves Ecuadorian Americans, Nicaraguan Americans, Peruvian Americans, Mexican Americans, and that seems to be the most comfortable way.
I agree. So one of the, in addition to pointing to the amnesia, to historical amnesia that the dominant narrative has regarding our communities, the other thesis that you have is that the Latino community can serve as a transformation template for the United States. And I'm going to read a quote from your book that maybe you can tell us what you mean by that. And this quote is from page 348. And it says, I guess this is how I understand that thesis in your book, what Hispanic children ultimately bring to the, I'm quoting here, what Hispanic children ultimately bring to the American table is a fresh perspective. We are past masters at border thinking, by thinking, multi-positioning, and so because we are practiced in logic that is more protean than rigid, we are uniquely equipped to flip the binary and fuse America as it has never been fused before.
Thank you. I really do believe that. I really do believe that we represent a kind of fusion in ourselves. The diversity within us is so large, and yet the sense that we belong to one another is so complete. The Cubans are nothing like Dominicans, right? I mean, especially the Cubans in this country. Cuba, the island itself right now, is almost 70% Afro-Cuban. They don't admit it, but it is 70% Afro-Cuban. The Cubans here, however, are the whites who left. So that is a very white population. The Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans who are in the Eastern Seaboard, really, a lot of them are so racially mixed that they don't even know when they come to this country and they're suddenly called Black, that they were Black. I have so many friends who didn't realize that they were Afro-Latinos until they came to this country and were called it. And so there's a huge difference between the Cubans and politically as well, because that goes together, and the Eastern Seaboard Puerto Ricanos and the Dominicanos. And then there's the Mexicans and the people from Central America who are entirely different, much more indigenous. The Andean people, myself, who are much more indigenous, much more mixed. We have a huge population of racially mixed people. This is really, really interesting to me. In 2010, it was 3% of Latinos were checking the box that says mixed race. In 2021, 67%. In just 10 years, people realized that they are mixed race. They were doing their DNA tests, they were talking to their grandparents, whatever it was, but to that incredible realization or honesty, perhaps, of coming to terms with that they are. You may think you're white in the Dominican Republic, because for a long time it was bad to be Black in the Dominican Republic, right? They were killing all the Haitians who were coming over. Trujillo was fierce about, although he was himself partly Black, he was fierce about whitening the country. So Dominicans arrive in New York and suddenly they're put in the American binary of being the one-drop rule where, oh, you look Black, so you must be Black. And they're put in that box. And I think we represent such an extraordinary diversity in this population that we are the essence of inclusivity. I mean, if people are doing the DEI inclusive thing, we represent it more than any other Americans. And let's not forget that when I'm talking about Latinos, we are talking about a US-born American citizenry. People forget that because the border is such a huge issue right now and has been for so long, that we forget that the percentage of US born Latinos is 90% US born. The American citizens, Latinos, is more than 80%. And people forget that we've been around a long time, generations of us. So, and with this very diverse, mix that we are, I think we represent in many, many ways the future that Americans have always wanted, which is, well, I hope that they have always wanted, and what democracy promises, which is a equality for all.
Thank you. And so speaking of that, it's election year, and so your book is very timely. As far as that goes, do you have any hopes or expectations regarding, how leaders, what they can take away from this, or how that might shape or not, the electoral processes coming up?
Thank you for that question. The question is about the election and are we an electorate? The answer is no. We are not a very clean, sharp swing vote that everyone wants us to be. I think the difference is that because we are not binary racially, my own theory is that we are not red-blue, easily red-blue. We see nuances, we cross over. Latinos tend to vote on personality and person by person rather than, crank all those Republican side or the Democratic side, the Democrat side. So the issue is not very clear right now, particularly because Latinos are very shy to vote. There are whole areas in Texas where the majority of the population is Latino and maybe 17% or 20% show up at the polls. Why? Because they don't trust them. There has been a very huge push to recruit Latinos. The Republican Party has an organization called Libre, which goes out and has recruited tremendously and done very successfully. Why? Because they're actually working on it. And the Democratic Party, the Democrats have not, they've just assumed that if Latinos are, grassroots coming up, people who need help, which in fact is false. We are not a burden on the government budget. We are basically net zero burden on the American government right now. We're not inclined to take welfare. The people assume that the Democrats assume that we are poor and in need of welfare. And it's that assumption has sort of led them astray because the Republican Party is eating their lunch at this point. Realizing that the people who go to the polls, the Latinos who go to the polls, half of them do not. And so that's a great opportunity for recruitment. I wrote a piece about this for the Washington Post. I would encourage, if you're interested in this particular issue, it was about 10 days ago in the Washington Post, specifically on this question of the race to get the Latino vote and the ways that the Republican Party has really, really been much more aggressive and much more productive than the Democrats right now.
Thank you. So in that vein, what is your target audience for the book? Who did you write this book? Is it for the community? Is it for the rest of the country? Is it intended by perhaps to go to what is LATINOLAND? Where is LATINOLAND?
I want Americans to realize who this population is. I wrote it really for non-Latinos, but I now appreciate that Latinos are finding themselves in it and answering a lot of questions about themselves in the book. So I hope it's a book that inspires, more than anything, inspires educators, persuades them that this is something that needs to be taught and actually respected in American history. That's really what I hope my readership will be, is that it influences people to understand who we are and what we've accomplished and the extraordinary promise of the Latino population.
Have you received any, what kind of reception has the book received so far? What do you expect?
It's very early. It's very early. I'm only 2 weeks in, but I've had really very nice reviews. I've had many of them are on the back of the jacket. You can see that right now. But it's doing well. It's considered in the last I looked in Amazon, and I try not to look. The last I looked on Amazon, it was actually called a bestseller. So I'm hoping that that's the case.
Yes, and just to illustrate the point, some of the critics or writers that endorse the book or have given it ranging reviews are Julia Alvarez, Juno Diaz, Sandra Cisneros, Walter Isaacson, Candice Millard, and Hector Tovar. Are only some of the people who have given this text accolades, so congratulations.
Thank you. I want to tell a story about the title,
Please,
if I may.
yes.
I haven't told this story to anybody before, but I'm going to tell it now. The title, and this is a very Latino story, because I did not have a title in September. And I was trying out titles, and my editor kept saying, no, that doesn't work. That will never sell. No, nobody will understand that. Don't use Spanish words. So so I didn't have a title in September, and the book was already, going to press, and I was visited in Washington, D.C. by a very good friend of mine, Sandra Cisneros, who is a wonderful writer. I hope you recognize the name. She wrote The House on Mango Street and many other wonderful things. And she called me up. She said, I'm in Washington, D.C., and let's have lunch. I said, well, it's my birthday. She said, more reason to have lunch. So we went to lunch in, I think it was an East Indian restaurant. And she said, you look really troubled and bad. You don't look good. And that's just kind of friend she is. She's very honest. And I said, well, I don't have a title for my book. I don't know what, we're just up a creek, completely up a creek on this. And she said, here's what you do. Here's what you do. You go home tonight, you get ready for bed, you get in bed, you turn off the lights, you look at the ceiling, and you think about something or somebody, preferably somebody, that you love unconditionally, absolutely unconditionally. And you concentrate and you focus on that person. This is very shamanic. She's a total witch. She said, and you think of that person and you really, really focus and concentrate, and you ask that person the question, and you go to sleep. In the morning, you'll have the answer. In the morning, the first thought in my head was LATINOLAND. Not only that, the story doesn't stop there. So I called my editor. First I called Sandra, I said, LATINOLAND. And she said, that's it, that's it. Yeah. And so I called my editor, and he said, that's it, that's it. My agent, same thing. So it became LATINOLAND. So in 2 weeks later, my editor calls me and he says, you need to come to New York because I need to talk to you about the schedule. And I need to look at you because I want you to really understand what the change in the schedule is. So I said, okay, easy trip to New York. Sat down, we were having lunch, and he said, here's the thing, we're moving it up. It's not going to be June or July, because we're moving it up to February. And that means that you have to really pay attention and deliver at every deadline from here going forward. And I said, fine, what's the publication date? And he said, February 20. And I almost fell off my chair. February 20 is my father's birthday.
Oh.
He was the one I thought of when I turned off the lights and asked the question. It's hard to characterize this because there are such strong threads of identity in this country. I mean, the Scandinavian Americans have their culture and preserve it. The German Americans certainly do. The Irish Americans do. I mean, when you're talking about America, you really can't say that the melting was complete. What drives, I think, the Latino population is what I said earlier. I think that there is that over time, the tendency to intermarry, to become, to actually become American through intermarriage, that is going to change the face of Latinos. Right now, what is it? 1 in 4 children in this country is a Latino. It's a very young population. It's going to stay Latino, very strongly Latino for a long time, because when you have children who are still identified, and the family structure of Latinos is so strong, there is, I don't know. I'm very aware of this because there has been in the companies that I have worked, corporations, Simon Schuster, Harper Price, Washington Post, Library of Congress, the effort to hire Latinos is very, very difficult. Why? Because they are they do not want to leave their families. They do not want to leave the enclaves where they live to go live in New York City or in Chicago or Boston, because they want to stay around. Family is the most important thing. That is, when you talk about assimilation, that is a huge factor for Latinos, because Americans are much more likely to leave their families and go elsewhere than we are. And that is something that more even to me than the intermarriage is a stronger sort of sociological fact that we have to deal with. The assimilation is clear because you have in single generations, you have people with 8th grade educations and menial jobs are having children who are lawyers and doctors and professionals. And this you see all the time. This is what I saw in the interviews that I did. This was a common story. The generational leap is really extraordinary among us. That's what I would say. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you very much.
I want to add, Maria, I think in your book you mentioned that even your sister, when you asked her if she had any Latino friends, she said, "You're my only Latina friend."
You're my Latina friend, yes. Yeah, it absolutely slew me. And then I realized I had to take my big sister and introduce her to a lot of people.
Thank you so much for writing this book. We grew up in San Diego and we don't speak Spanish because in the 60s and 70s, they didn't want that in schools.
Right.
Very sad. We understand it, but we just,
Right.
we're learning still. We're going back to that. But I want to thank you for that.
There are a lot of people like you. Yeah.
And we're fighting that. And it was from protection, I think, from our parents. Our father who experienced discrimination firsthand in Texas. He was protecting us, and we realized that. Are you involved at all with the National Museum of the Latino American? Where is that? And it went so far and then nothing.
Yeah, and it's because it takes time. You know, when the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. was being built, and Lonnie Bunch who was the director. I mean, he was going out in his car to, places that said, "I have something in my attic you don't look at." He was going, and it took him time to put that museum together. It's fabulous. Jorge Samanillo, who is the director of the Museum of the American Latino, actually interviewed me in Washington last week at Politics and Prose, the bookstore there. And so I was more interested in interviewing him. So the conversation was very rich because, it does take time. This is such a diverse population with so many stories. And the Cuban story, obviously, is not the Mexican story. And you've got to get that right. And you've got to represent everybody. And at this point, I am involved because I'm supporting it, and he is a friend. And it's going to take him 10 years. So you're not going to see that museum for 10 years. They're probably not going to break ground for another 2, at least. There's still deliberation on it, where on the mall it's going to be. But it's a magnificent sort of ambitious project. And I can't wait. I mean, I hope I'm still around to see it happen.
Immigration is a very divisive issue in the United States. Is it similarly contentious among Latinos?
I'm sorry, I'm for some reason I'm
Is it
having an
similarly-
echo in my ear. Could someone repeat that?
Immigration
Yeah.
is highly divisive, an issue right now in the United States. Is it similarly contentious among Latinos?
Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. Yes. I think some of the strongest opinions comes from Latinos who have been here generations or who came and did, all the right paperwork and have been here legally. It's a wound to actually, first of all, be portrayed as a group that is, coming in great rushes of undocumented, biblical masses to this country, when in fact, it damages them, it damages us to be pictured in that way. So I have found that the strongest opinions, to get immigration bill, it's been 30 years since the last immigration bill. And the perceptions are so weird because, the president who was hardest on immigration was Barack Obama. People don't realize it's not necessarily Trump who was correcting the problem of, crazy, wild, undisciplined immigration. It was a Democrat president. So the perceptions are all wrong, but the immigration is a huge issue, and the bipartisan recent effort that crashed was ridiculous. I mean, was it not? I mean, you've got a pressing situation, one of the most pressing situations in this country, and we can't get an immigration act or a bill to actually correct the situation. It hurts those people at the border coming across just as much as it hurts the rest of the country. Thank you for the question.
Do we have more questions?
Here, and I'll come up to the front.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing about you. My name is Ariana. Sorry. Thank you so much. I have a few thoughts. When the gentleman was speaking earlier about the dominant culture being white, I am a Mexican and I have been here for 20 years. I'm 30 years old, by the way. And I am finding myself learning a lot of the different things that I've learned in the last 20 years, especially like feeling like I deserve taking space in a setting where it is predominantly more white people around me, and in every aspect of my life, like I feel discomfort when I am in a room full of majority of like white people. And I wanted to bring this up because I'm not sure how much it's being talked about. And I'm a documented immigrant, alien. All of these political words are interestingly and very funny in a sarcastic way. And so I wanted to ask you if you or anyone in this room too, who is a Latino, has experienced that feeling of discomfort when they're surrounded by mostly white people, and what is your advice to non-Hispanic or / white people in regards to helping Latinos feel more empowered and deserving of taking up space in every aspect, every different position or environment?
Thank you for that question. It's a very, very important question. I think a lot of us have felt the sting of discrimination. I certainly did as a child. I was told by fellow students in my public school that I stank and go home. Go home to where you came from. You stink. Exceptionally hurtful sort of things. And I remember being spit at in Wyoming when I went to visit my grandfather. I remember being spit at by people and being told to go home. And what I would say is there is a superpower, I think, in people who have faced that sort of discrimination. I think there is a sense, at first there is, of course, the sting of it. But then there is the sense that you have something that others do not. That biculturality, that sense of coming and contributing to a country that may not even recognize your skills. You are doing something that most people are not. And the fact that you can gather that strength and you can use it, I think that's what you need to focus on. That's what I focused on at the time. It's like, I'm going to show them, I'm better, I'm just as good, I'm maybe even better, and I can do this. And I think my whole life has been, yeah, I'm just as good and I'm going to do better. And I'm going to do this right. And I think, in fact, it has given me steam, that sort of early exposure to kind of discrimination. Yeah. But best of luck.
Keep taking up space.
Thanks, very compelling presentation. Thank you very much. This is the World Affairs Council. So many diasporas try to influence American foreign policy towards their country of origin. Now, the Cuban Americans, of course, have been doing that very successfully since the 1980s. Latin America is a very diverse place, as you pointed out, and as you're very aware. But what does your book, your findings, tell us about the way the very diverse Latin American community in the United States, LATINOLAND, how do they see American foreign policy toward Latin America, and specifically towards their countries of origin? And are they trying to organize in ways to influence American foreign policy towards their countries of origin?
Well, your question actually involves a lot of bits and parts, because on the one hand, the neglect of Latin America, the absolute lack of curiosity about Latin America has been the dominant thinking I think in the United States. I'll never forget when Ronald Reagan came back from his tour in Latin America. He said, there are a lot of little countries down there. I didn't know there were so many.
And he mixed up Libya and Brazil.
Right. So there is, you start with there is a lot of ignorance. There's a lot of lack of curiosity. I mean, I remember coming up, through college and, workplaces, nobody ever asked me, where are you from? I mean, I tell the story here in this book of my first roommate at my university heard Beirut and never really put together that I wasn't, that I was probably not from Beirut, even though I was talking about Peru all the time. So the lack of curiosity is one thing. And I think the history, because when you ask that question, I get echoes in my head about the American interventions in Latin America and the many ways that the interventions that have actually prompted the immigration waves. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's totally connectable that the interventions, in Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba, the appropriation of Puerto Rico. I think the whole story has been America doing the manifest destiny southward, but they're not learning very much about the places down there. So there's a kind of as far as the World Affairs Council goes. I mean, all of you, many of you have worked in Latin America, know a great deal about Latin America, and have actually studied it. And I think probably if you have frustrations about the fact that it has continued to be ignored and to be thought of as a destination to extract things from and to manipulate rather than real countries with real ambitions and real places in the world. So that's
and we are finding, what did these 60 million Latin Americans doing in the United States to correct, to increase the interest in the American foreign policy circles towards Latin America and perhaps to correct some of the.
They need to do that. They need to correct that, absolutely. And this is why the invisibility really worries me. This is why I'm trying to change that narrative, because if we are actually made real and actually maybe even paid attention to by the media and by the important decision-making places in this country, then perhaps we can actually learn something more about, I mean, do people really know the history of Puerto Rico, even though that is the second largest Latino group in the country? Probably not. Probably Americans don't realize that this is a second-class citizen who cannot vote for the presidential elections, who can still go or who are going to fight in foreign wars for the United States of America, and are very often come back and are not allowed to eat in restaurants. I mean, once you notice this population in your midst, perhaps my hope is also the resulting achievement might be that you might pay attention to the whole hemisphere. Yeah, thank you.
Just a real quick one. I think your academic studies were Russian and then Chinese. Were you thinking of going into the foreign service? I was curious why you would study those.
People generally think I had visions for the CIA actually. Yeah, exactly. No, I studied Russian because I began it at the age of 11. The JFK's program for critical languages, right, way back when. So I started Russian because it was offered in my school in South New Jersey. So a very elderly, wonderful elderly woman who was the daughter of the mayor of St. Petersburg ended up in Summit, New Jersey, and decided she wanted to be a teacher. There were 3 people in the class. I learned a lot. I went on and took it in university and graduated with a degree in Russian language and literature. And then I didn't know what to do with it. The only people who were interviewing at Northwestern, which is where I went, Russian majors were the CIA. So I decided that maybe I wanted to do linguistics because I already had Spanish, I had French, and I had Russian. And I ended up in Asia studying Mandarin Chinese and to try to broaden the scope of what I had studied. And then took a degree in linguistics to make it all make sense. And then I left it all behind. Thank you.
Of course, first, thank you very much for the presentation. You also did an excellent job as the moderator. As an international development person myself, also as the outgoing president of San Diego World Affairs Council, so trying to leave sort of a bit of a legacy for strategy, what comes next. But again, partly because of my international development background, I'm always the so what and so what do we do about it? Great story, so what? So what do we do about it? And you probably know that the San Diego World Affairs Council is part of the National World Affairs Councils of America, 93 chapters in 45 states. What can San Diego World Affairs Council do in this community? And as you've mentioned, we've got the large population, we're on the border. So we have a lot, due to our strategic positioning, we have more reason to care also. But what would you advise the San Diego World Affairs Council to do at the local level that would move the needle the way you think it could or should be moved? And then as a piece of that, is that a model? What we would do, is that a model that we should share with World Affairs Council to spread to the others? Not to forget, the week before Thanksgiving every year, the World Affairs Councils of America have an annual conference in Washington, DC. If this is an important issue for the United States, that is an important forum where making a presentation about this, having a panel discussion, getting your books out ahead of time could also help move the needle, educate more people. And if we're all in Washington, that's even better, where policymakers are. Invite them to this forum.
Thank you, Patricia. I think that's really important, an important question, and congratulations for the work that the World Affairs Council does and that network that it represents in the rest of the country. I would say that the urgent need is in education. People need to know the sort of information that I'm trying to deliver in this book. People need to know the history, not only the history back then, but also the power of this population, the potential of this population, the economic promise of this population. And I think the secret, my mission is really in changing that narrative to really learn what the contributions are. Education is the key.
Can I follow up, because this is so important, and I don't know if that's what Professor Feinberg was looking for as well. He gave us a strategy, implementation plan, actions, whatever, however you want to word it. Is it the Latino population's role and responsibility to do what you're saying versus, oh, I really care about this issue and I have no personally, I have no Latin American blood that I'm aware of, and I haven't even really done Latin America. Let's just use that illustration. But I really care about the issue. Is it appropriate? Am I the voice to carry that? Or does it need to be the Latino voices to carry that? And if that's true, then what role, for example, would the World Affairs Council have at the local level to engage the Latino community, who I believe it's their voice that needs to tell those stories? My personal opinion. So you can
I think it's an American story, frankly. I think it's an American story, and I think that all Americans need to be concerned about the fact that we don't know anything about what is now 20%, going to be 30% by the year 2060. Population in this country, you have to know something about your people. We are everybody's people. We are the American people, and we need to be represented as Americans in the American story. And that's really it. And that means that you're responsible too, as an American, to get this population story into the narrative, because that's who we all are. We're all in it together, and we are a very big part of it, growing every minute. Really, truly, the Latino population being very young is going to, it's the growth. I mean, just in businesses, okay, in businesses, the growth has been 44% in the last 10 years. The national average has been a growth of 4%. Imagine this boom. Now, don't you have an obligation as a citizen of this country to let people know from a very young age what this country consists of? Because we're here and we are part of that story.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Marie Arana will view.
To our president, La Presidenta, Christine Sheckler, for the Sunday World Affairs Council. And the one and only who worked so hard to put all this in here, our Vice President, Catherine Greenberg. Thank you to our board member, Angelique Gaffney. She's in charge of the food, drinks. Thank you so much. And she closed the door when we were all freezing. Fireside. So stay curious and continue educating yourself. We have, in April, we'll take you to a journey to the Middle East with the one and only William Solemson. Right there. So April 16th.